Hello, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Samantha Hislop of the Canadian Network on Cuba, which is a network of organizations across Canada who stand in solidarity with Cuba and its right to exist as an independent, sovereign nation, choosing its own path forward, free of imperial aggression and occupation of its lands, free of foreign political interference, and free of the illegal economic blockade that's imposed on it by the United States. Tonight, to honor and celebrate Black History Month, we're going to be speaking with two very special guests and receiving a report back on the 7th Africa-Cuba Solidarity Conference in South Africa that happened just a few short weeks ago, and an update on Cuba-African relations. So our two special guests this evening are Isaac Saney and Cikiah Thomas. So I'll just provide a quick background on the two of these outstanding individuals, and I will start with Isaac. So Isaac Saney is a Black Studies and Cuba specialist at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, where he's an associate professor and the coordinator of the Black and African Diaspora Studies program, the first majors program in Black and African Diaspora Studies in Canada. His teaching, research, and scholarship encompass Cuba, Africa, the Caribbean, Black Canadian history, the global Black liberation struggle, and reparations. Isaac holds a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He's currently serving as a special advisor to the Canadian Network on Cuba, and he is author of Cuba, A Revolution in Motion. A major area of his research is Cuba's relationship with Africa, which resulted in his recent book, Cuba-Africa and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. And I'm just going to share a review, one review from the most recent book, Cuba-Africa and Apartheid's End. And this was from Dr. Giulia Bonacci. She studies intellectual history and the popular cultures that circulate between Africa and the African diaspora. She wrote about the book. Isaac Saney offers an authoritative account of Cuba's role in liberating Namibia and South Africa that is centered on the Battle of Cuito-Cuanza Valley. And with skillful attention to detail and a meticulous use of sources, the book exposes the full breadth of Cuba's internationalism and updates the historical and symbolic ties between the Caribbean island and the African continent. And our other special guest this evening is Cikiah Thomas. Cikiah is an individual with a rich history of international experience in political activism. In 2001, he participated in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism held in South Africa. A year later, he played a significant role in planning the African and African Descendant World Conference Against Racism held in Barbados. The conference led to the establishment of the Global African Congress, which he chaired from 2002 until 2022. The Global African Congress's main objective is to promote equitable distribution of global resources by fighting for reparatory justice. The organization advocates for policies that combat institutional racism, raise awareness, and mobilize international solidarity to decolonize the remaining Caribbean and South American territories under European and American direct colonial domination. Additionally, the Global African Congress works to ensure that all Africans and Indigenous peoples worldwide receive respect and recognition. Cikiah Thomas also strongly supports the Cuban Revolution and believes in people's right to self-determination. So we'll get right into it. Just a few short weeks ago was the 7th Africa-Cuba Solidarity Conference held in Mbombela, South Africa. And that served as a crucial platform for African countries and other global regions were represented there as well. But for African countries to strengthen and deepen international solidarity and their ties with the Cuban people. So the first question that I have for you two is regarding US foreign policy on Cuba. So when we think about foreign policy towards Cuba, which is the country that's been imposing this economic warfare since Cuba's revolution, essentially, one thing that seems to have stuck in people's mind is that Obama is often seen as somebody who advanced toward détente with Cuba. But the declaration from this conference that came out of this 7th African Continental Meeting of Solidarity with Cuba reminds us that actually in December 2014, Obama actually reaffirmed adherence to the achievement of US interests in Cuba. So So how did Obama's policies at the time towards Cuba differ from Joe Biden's policies now?
Well, if I may, I'd say that one of the things that marked it is that within the United States, since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, there's always been a divergence of different approaches on how to undermine and eventually eliminate the Cuban Revolution. There were those who adopted a very aggressive position, which was to isolate Cuba economically and also engage in a massive campaign of destabilization. So we know there was the there was the imposition of the economic sanctions beginning very early on in the early 60s, culminating with the emergence of what we can call the economic blockade in February of 1962, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which preceded that in 1961, and then a whole series, for example, Operation Mongoose, but a whole series of CIA plans aimed at assassinating Cuban leaders and economic sabotage. So you have this aggressive approach. But of course, the Cuban Revolution survived. And as the Cuban Revolution survived, there were those who said, well, the best way to undermine it is to find other ways, right? Okay, that we perhaps can flood it with our capital, right? And so on. And of course, there was growing dissent within the Latin America and the Caribbean, right? As Cikiah knows very well. And there was in the early 70s, the fact that Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean islands, for example, as they became independent, established relations with Cuba. And there was a 50th anniversary meeting celebration that took place last year, marking all of these things, right? So it was very exciting. So even during the Carter administration, we had, and even during Ford, an attempt to sort of have that kind of different calibration of the approach. The point is, what happened is that by the time Obama comes along, they were incredibly isolated in Latin America. Latin American countries had stood up and said they would not come to another summit of the Americas if Cuba wasn't included. There's the massive votes at the United Nations from 1992 condemning the blockade. So the US was isolated on this policy, and the Cuban Revolution had survived. Particularly, I think it's important to understand, when everybody was predicting it would collapse in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union and so-called socialism or existing socialism collapsed, everybody thought it would disappear. And Cuba had survived, and increasingly Cuba had broken its diplomatic isolation, right? And people were condemning US economic policy. So when Obama stepped in, he basically talked about, turning another page in history and so forth. But he was very clear that this was a different approach to undermining and eliminating the Cuban Revolution, right? The Cuban Revolution was very strong. And my feeling is that this was an effort, in a sense, as I said, to say that, well, this is part of the idea that one of the reasons they were able to turn back these socialist experiments or these progressive experiments everywhere was that the US with its economic might could flood places with capital and ideologically undermine. And they also argue that's one of the things they played in the collapse of what happened in Eastern Europe. So they wanted to replay that particular game. Their hyper-aggressive policy had failed. It merely strengthened the Cuban Revolution, so they adopted a different tact. Okay, and of course, what happens is Trump wins the election. And Trump, representing certain sections of the U.S. ruling class that wanted to carry on this hyper-aggression against Cuba, that wanted to reimpose its domination in Latin America, imposed over 240, some people say as much as 243 separate vicious measures, right? Okay, that were aimed at crushing the Cuban Revolution. In the midst of COVID, and I knew the CNC ran a campaign to run syringes to Cuba, and calling on the United States together with other solidarity organizations, that in a time of this pandemic, you had to actually lessen the blockade because, Cuba was facing very significant challenges because obviously it could not obtain certain things on the international market because of US economic sanctions, this economic warfare. They could help it fight the pandemic. We know that Cuba handled this extremely well. We know that Cuba sent international medical brigades all across the world. And we know that Cuba developed 5 vaccines, right, that are among the best in dealing with the pandemic. But in the midst of this, tourism collapsed, okay? And Cuba was facing very significant economic crisis. As the election was unfolding, when Biden was now contending with Trump, who was going to take over the White House, Biden, I know this is a long answer, but I think it's important to understand this context. Biden quite often said he was going to return to the Obama policy. Okay. What I think happened was that, and we all remember the attempt on July 11th of before the election, okay, July 11th, 2021, if I remember it correctly, right, the exact date, there was this Cuba was facing very serious economic problems, and the U.S. carefully orchestrated a campaign to bring down the revolution, and it failed, right? It clearly failed, right? And so on. What I think when that happens, right, this is during the Biden administration when this occurs, right? And I think it's important to understand that while Biden during the election was basically talking about going back to the Obama policy, he wins the election. And I don't have access to the documents. You don't get declassified until much longer later. But I think it's akin to what President Kennedy faced. Under Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs invasion was launched in April of 1961. He inherited that from the Eisenhower administration, right? And he was told by the CIA at that time that this would be successful, right? That Cuban Revolution would be brought down. What I think happened is Biden received a briefing as president-elect that Cuba is on its knees, one, because of this economic crisis, okay? Two, there's a new leadership because there's been a historic transition in the leadership. President Diaz-Canel has now been president of Cuba, and also there was, the head of the Communist Party. There'd been a transition to a new leadership. The historic generation that made the Cuban Revolution was now retreating into the sidelines, right? Okay, as advisors, but they were no longer front and center. And of course, this campaign that emerged on July the 11th, right, had to have been organized, right, because the amount of social media, right, the amount of coordination that one saw, this had to be months in the planning. I may be wrong, but it had to be months in the planning, and it had to have been planned under the Trump administration or the regime, and it was inherited. And so Biden thought, well, I can now accomplish what we wanted to do. The aim of destroying the Cuban Revolution is the same that Obama held with Trump, that has held with every single U.S. administration. The difference was that when Obama launched this different approach, this economic situation, the world geopolitical situation was different, and Biden thought he could do this. So there hasn't been, so what has happened, the goal has remained the same, but Biden now realizes that this is the goal, to crush Cuba. They have the opportunity now with Cuba's economic challenges and problems it faces, right? And so I think that's what connects it. So I think in that sense, the strategic aim is the same, but Biden actually believes he can destroy it. What is important as well is, just as during the Obama administration, the United States is isolated in Latin American world opinion. It's very, very clear, right? And also, they may believe that in order to maintain their role as the global hegemons, they have to control Latin America. And perhaps that's why they have the heightened aggression against Cuba. Everybody knows that if the Cuban Revolution were to collapse, it would have significant impact on Latin American independence and sovereignty and so forth. So I think in that sense, what we're looking at here is, I think, an ever-increasing ramping up of U.S. hostility to Cuba, but will only be stopped, I think, by international movement and by international actions of various countries ignoring this. And I know Cikiah has a lot to add to this, because Cikiah, has advanced, and through GATT, they have advanced a program of where we must defy the blockade, that the blockade itself exists, okay? And in just simply opposing it through rhetoric, we can actually begin to defy it. So I hope that provides sort of a context for this, right? Obama and Biden and Trump and all, they share the same objective. They just, it's different tactics and different means. And at the time when Obama launched this, the revolution was strong. There was a new generation that was coming forward. Everything was solidified. And then we know the COVID pandemic really accelerated changes in geopolitics, right? And perhaps created the situation where the United States thought it could deliver the coup de grace, as they say, right? And of course, they failed.